Hello, my name is Oscar Molina Romualdo. I'm currently a student at BMCC enrolled in Business Organization and Management. Today I'm going to be discussing structure frames, specifically those within chapters 3 and 5 in Reforming Organizations by Lee Bullman. So I think one of the first things brought up by chapter 3 in the book is specifically talking about the central beliefs of the structural frame, specifically in its rationality and faith, to determine an appropriate array of roles and responsibilities that would minimize any distractions from the task at hand, and kind of determining what specific things need to be done or implemented to better assist the company in functioning as effectively and efficiently as possible. I think the first thing that starts to talk about in the chapter is talking about having the structural frame providing people in the right direction through defining their jobs and their responsibilities and what they're expected to do to better reflect a productive environment and effectively ensure that there is an ongoing growth for both the company itself and the employee. So in the chapter itself, they talk about 6 assumptions, specifically in the structural frame. So some of these assumptions have to do with how organizations need to establish goals and objectives to kind of strategize how to meet these objectives as well, specifically to have a really set task at hand to really make sure that everyone is aware of what's the actual end goal or end product that's required of them. Following this is more so the organization is trying to increase efficiency and enhancing performance, and in that way it's done through monitoring metrics and making sure that there's a specialization in labor to really give them a groundwork of what's expected to avoid overusing them or expecting too much from an employee that is specifically geared toward a specific task. The next would have to do with how the organization kind of coordinates and facilitates all these different movements within the company or business, specifically in how they handle certain situations and interactions with clients to employees, employees to employee, and an employee to upper management. There's also this idea that there is a ability to restructure and reorganize when certain situations or problems arise, so that the company is very fluid and very capable of switching tactics to really deliver a different method of a strategy to mitigate the issues that have come about through various changes of whether it's environment or situational, or if it's something within the company itself, such as leadership changes. Specifically looking into what ways that they can mitigate these situations. One of the last assumptions is how the company itself kind of organizes themselves through strategy in terms of their workforce, in terms of their environment, and in terms of their technology. I think specifically how these 3 different sectors of the corporation would kind of meld into each other, and how well they function within each other, and in terms of who is doing what specifically in these sectors, such as support roles or specific employees designed or specialized to handle certain situations that the company might throw at them. So in this chapter, we are introduced to 2 figures, specifically Frederick W. Taylor and Max Weber. Frederick W. Taylor specifically talks about how he designed and studied breaking apart tasks into 2-minute sections to kind of see specifically how workers would handle their task at hand when there was really a specific set time on handling certain situations and tasks. And this really starts to influence the assumptions that were mentioned previously on how specific roles and responsibilities are outlined. It would better assist the employee into knowing exactly what's expected of them in terms of performance and in terms of productivity. The second would be Frederick W. Taylor, who specifically pioneered a couple rules and guidelines to kind of aid different organizations, specifically outlining a division of labor, a clear division of labor, specifically to really assist large teams into kind of categorizing themselves in the goals and specific tasks that they were assigned to better assist the overall picture. I think after that, he mentions the talk of hierarchy of offices, specifically in how there was a specific set division between different employees, specifically upper management, employees, support groups, and different teams to really facilitate the mission at hand within that organization. There's also this idea of kind of having technical qualifications and specific qualifications that would better assist them in picking employees within the corporation to kind of stay away from this idea of kind of keeping with family ties or people that you might be familiar with, rather than just choosing people who are specifically qualified for these roles. The last part really ties into this idea that he wanted to create an environment where long-term careers were held, specifically in how they promoted and hired new people to really kind of facilitate their movement within the corporation if there was the chance of moving up. So it really emphasizes this idea that having a person for a long time career was really beneficial for both the company and the person itself, to making sure that there was this stable relationship between the two. Throughout the chapter, it mentions how organizations are open systems that deal with a lot of different changes and an erratic environment, just due to how quick one needs to be able to respond to certain changes that could arise, just based off of environment or even external factors such as industry changes or leadership changes or mergers that happen within corporations, things like that. So it's kind of mentioned how there is set expectations to what the corporation is required to do, but a lot of times the outcome might not be that. And the idea is that they're able to restructure and reformulate new strategies to really handle these situations better. We are reintroduced into Mintzberg, who mentions this idea of coherent strategy, specifically in the 5 Ps, such as plan, perspective, pattern, position, and ploy. This really has to deal with the idea of strategizing certain situations or all the larger pictures at hand to really handle certain situations as a whole within organizations. A lot of the times there are issues that arise, and there are issues that are mentioned specifically on structural design, and this comes with how to allocate work, specifically how to coordinate different efforts and kind of parceling out those responsibilities to different teams or set employees to handle those situations. It's given a mention of comparing humans to ants in terms of specialization, kind of exemplifying the idea that humans prefer a set specialization to kind of really aim in assisting them in accomplishing their goals and tasks, but also aiming to assist the corporation as a whole, so that there's a set group of people or set person specifically tasked at handling that assignment. It does mention that there are some drawbacks to having this kind of specialization in terms of developing apathy or absenteeism or even resistance, just due to how burdensome it can be to have such a focus on a specialization for just a person or a group of people. But on the other hand, it brings up this idea that it kind of gives an idea of predictability and uniformity within that specific team. Just because there is a set expectation and goal at hand, there isn't anything that's surprising to them. They're constantly a set defined role with what they're expected to do within that organization. So this tends to be the better side of specialization, rather than focusing on the idea of how burdensome it can be to a specific person or team. Next, one of the big issues that organizations need to deal with in terms of the structural frame is how to group these people into working units. Mintzberg gives specifically some ideas on how to kind of assist in grouping these people. He mentions the idea of basing it on knowledge or skills so that it could be kind of a team that's generally well versed in the same field so that they're capable of doing the same task. The other one would have to deal with when they work, specifically client interactions or specific times that they're expected to do the job. A lot of the times there's also this idea that... So the second issue at hand in terms of organizing structures is how to categorize or group people into different roles. Mintzberg gives a couple ideas specifically on how to group these individuals, such as by knowledge or skill. These groups of individuals would specifically be better geared toward specific tasks just based off of their experience. The other types of grouping that would be dealt with is specific shift work, specifically when they work and how long they work. The following would be specific products or services that are being put out by this group to kind of categorize them away from others. Following that would kind of be how another type of categorization is kind of categorizing them into specific client service needs. So he gives an example of doctors and hospitals, specifically different categories of doctors specifically focused on different types of care, whether it's emergency care or pediatric care or any other types of care that's offered in hospitals. The following would also be... God damn it, they're so loud. The last two have to deal with geography, and that specifically entails location specifically, whether it's international or home corporate offices or remote work. The last one has to deal with process flow, and that really kind of the idea of kind of client fulfillment. So receiving an order from a client or service, and then processing that order and then sending it off. And that's really focused on kind of client expectation and need is not necessarily constant. It's only occurring specific times when clients are ordering services. And this is really a prime example of like e-commerce and online services such as BOPUSes and multiple different industries to include clothing, beauty, even food at this point. So it's an interesting thing to see on how people are categorized in specific teams to really better aim in facilitating their tasks within organizations. Mintzberg then introduces this idea of two major approaches on control and planning, specifically action planning and performance control. Performance control has to deal with kind of specifying the end result without really specifying the means to get there, whereas performance control gives a clear measurable metric on what particularly the individual needs to accomplish to meet those goals. And they kind of go hand in hand in terms of kind of having this reasonable and clear-cut idea of what's expected to be able to accomplish these metrics that are expected from the organization. In this chapter, we do talk about vertical organization, and this is a pretty clear-cut set of structure, specifically having at the top of the organization upper management, following that would be middle management and department heads. And this is the idea of kind of structuring themselves to have kind of a middleman to really assist and assign work to lower teams in the hierarchy. It gives the middle manager kind of this enough authority to really handle situations and be able to approve decision making to better assist the movement within this organization. And it assists in making sure that there's a lot of productivity within all levels of the hierarchy, specifically kind of focusing on middle management in handling the day-to-day operations within this kind of organization. They tend to lean on specialists who are well versed in the specific task at hand, rather than kind of having to lean on themselves to handle situations that might come up. In Chapter 4, we're introduced to a couple of situations where issues arise due to the lack of responsibilities that are not defined well enough for employees to really follow through with what they're expected to do. Employees will often feel obliged to have to fix their tasks to better aim their personal goals rather than really focusing on the bigger picture at hand. And this really tends to be because of the lack of structure that they are given from upper management. The following would actually be another situation on when employees aren't really given too many tasks or have a clear idea of what is expected to do, that they're often bored and become burdensome throughout the corporation just due to the lack of productivity that they're given, because there is nothing there's nothing assisting them in kind of figuring out what's expected for them to do. And this lack of information causes them to just become stagnant within the corporation and end up not having a very productive value for the corporation. And this would end up bringing a lot of issues specifically for the employee when metrics are reviewed specifically. Mintzberg actually introduces this model of structure that really defines roles and responsibilities that are expected for this organization. On the bottom of his model, it gives this operating core that is specifically geared toward client services and products that are supposed to be output from these workers. Right above this operating core would be the administrative side of the organization, and these are the people who are assisting in day-to-day decisions and really setting the groundwork for employees underneath them to be aware of what is expected of them in terms of metrics such as performance and productivity and how much product is being output specifically in what their industry is in. On top of that would end up being senior managers, and this is the people who kind of track the whole picture or the environment at hand, kind of determining what strategy they should use to kind of shape the overall design of the organization. And they work hand in hand with the administrative component of this model, but they end up actually having to look at the larger picture rather than smaller individuals in the administrative side of the organization who kind of handle set specific teams or departments. In this model specifically, there is actually two different parts of the organization on the left and right side of the upper management, and this would have to do with the administrative component. Alongside the administrative component would end up being the technostructure, which basically houses the specialist and the analyst who kind of standardize specific measurable and outputted procedures within this organization. They're used to kind of support and facilitate the work of others throughout the organization, specifically kind of geared towards supporting the administrative roles. The next part alongside of the administrative role would end up being the support staff, and these people specifically support or facilitate the work of others throughout the organization, aiding and ensuring that there is a support system for both the administrative side and the operating core of this model. Stemming from this model, we actually end up getting the 5 structural configurations that were mentioned in my previous video, specifically simple structure, machine bureaucracy, professional bureaucracy, divisionalized form, and adhocracy. I won't go into much detail on these specifically just because they were mentioned previously, but there is this set role and categorization specifically aimed to function for specific types of organizations, depending on what factors are brought about due to specific products that are being output, or the size of the organization itself, or how they'd like to handle certain situations, such as delegating different roles and assignments. Depending on the size, would definitely be a factor in terms of having department heads specifically geared toward handling certain facets of the organization, such as accounting or human resources. And this really does go hand in hand with this idea of specialization. In this chapter, we're actually introduced to this new idea of Helgenson's web of inclusion, and this kind of argues that hierarchy is primarily a male-driven depiction, quite different from the structures that are created by female executives whose kind of goal is to focus on the organization's relationships and this idea of nurturing them to really facilitate open lines of communication and kind of blurring the lines between the distinctive roles that hierarchy tends to put down. Later in the chapter, we're brought on the idea of organizations and the reasons behind why they intend to restructure or reorganize. And this often comes from responding to major problems or opportunities that might arise for the organization. And it's mentioned in this chapter a couple of various pressures that could be factors in why corporations or organizations restructure. And these include technology changes, organization growth, and leadership changes. And even environmental shifts. And they give the example of the American Telephone and Telegraph Organization that had such a monopoly on the industry, but ended up having to restructure due to a large competitive rise from other corporations that were doing the same thing within the industry. In terms of technology changes, that just specifically gears towards handling certain situations with the aid of technology or having to upgrade or change certain procedures and policies that are set in place just due to how much technology influences organizations. Leadership change is pretty self-explanatory, and this focuses on the idea that through leadership change, there often is a restructuring due to the expectations that they might have, specifically just based off their experience or their idea of how organizations tend to work better, specifically on how they're structured. The following would be another example of a pressure that organizations face, not so maybe a negative thing, but organizational growth tends to be a factor in determining restructuring just due to the fact that with growth, companies or organizations need to reorganize themselves to better acclimate to a larger corporation, just due to the size from these changes that occur for organizations. And this just has the idea of how to restructure massive amount of people to better facilitate the productivity and the product output that's expected for this organization. In Chapter 5, we're introduced to this idea of different arrangements for organization. And the first one deals with boss arrangements, specifically focused on having one person be the authoritative figure over others. And this tends to deal with information and decisions that flow from the top down. Group members often have to give information and communicate specifically to this one person to deal with certain decisions and changes that might have to be made specifically in helping the organization. This tends to be a little bit more efficient with smaller teams or with an authority figure who can handle and stay on top of all things. So this ends up being not so effective if the team is too large or if there's too many expectations for the one person to deal with in terms of workload. This often is better with straightforward situations and effectively with simple tasks to have an authoritative figure to set down specific expectations that they have for this organization. An alternative to this is having a management level below the boss, and then these two individuals would have the authority over specific areas of the group work. And essentially now information and decisions flow through both of them. This would better assist the boss in having a larger grasp on all the things that are occurring within this organization through the middleman. This type of arrangement assists the boss in dealing with more of the strategizing and dealing with relationships with higher ups than him. But this often adds a layer of limitation between the lower level and the upper management in terms of communication, and this tends to be slower in this type of organization. And it is mentioned that it does tend to erode morale and performance just due to the lack of communication between the lowest individuals to the highest management within these types of organizations. An alternative to the boss arrangement would deal with adding a layer of middle management that would aim to supervise the lower level employees and communicate day-to-day operations to the boss. This does end up giving an extra layer of limitation of communication within employees to upper management, and this also does tend to give issues with operational and top-level managers in terms of how they want to run certain things, and this ends up having them kind of butt heads with each other, and inevitably kind of having this power struggle with who kind of wants to lead stuff in charge. God damn it, Spark. This open line of communication aids in assisting transactions with having an easier flow, but this could also have some drawbacks due to having a weak link within the team that could undermine the entire enterprise as a whole, just due to being unable to work effectively and coordinate certain things that they'd like for the task. A final option of arrangement would end up being the all-channel arrangement, specifically designed to create multiple connections so that everyone can talk to everyone else. This is the type of arrangement where information will flow to one group of people to another, requiring multiple people to touch base to come to an end decision. Morale tends to be pretty high with this type of arrangement, but this heavily depends on good communication skills, tolerating ambiguity, embracing diversity, and are able to manage conflicts well within each other. This type of arrangement does end up causing a little bit more time to be mitigated. A final arrangement of organization would be the all-channel design, and this specifically creates multiple connections so that everyone can talk to each other freely. This heavily relies on individuals to be able to communicate effectively, free from ambiguity and embracing diversity, and also being able to handle conflicts if they arise. This does have high morale within the organization, but it does also end up slowing decision making just because of how many individuals has to touch the work in terms of kind of coming to an end product. It talks about having high performing teams having the right amount of mix of expertise within these groups, specifically kind of geared toward being able to lean on one each other to meet these objectives that they're given. And then this falls into the same idea of having high-performing teams develop this common commitment to working relationships. And this really focuses on the idea of how they delegate certain tasks, basically on who does what in this type of team, and even dealing with how they schedule themselves and kind of setting themselves up for how they adhere to these types of policies that they put in place. Effective teams will eventually explore who is best suited for a particular task rather than kind of depending on everyone to do so, which ends up speeding up the process because there is this individual that could be able to do specific things to further break down their roles and responsibilities to aim on. One of the last characteristics mentioned is having high-performing teams be able to develop a common commitment to a working relationship, and this deals with kind of how they handle themselves within that team in that organization. So dealing with how they handle scheduling and who does what within the organization, specifically in specific tasks that are given to them from upper management. So rather than just depending on the entire team to do one thing, there's able to The last characteristic of a high-performing team is their ability to develop a commitment to working relationships, and this essentially deals with how they handle a particular job and how they further break down their roles to specific individuals within this type of team, specifically geared toward having one set person do a specific part of the task given to them to better optimize their efficiency within this end result. This also deals with how they schedule themselves to adhere to the skills and what's expected to be able to develop their skills within this organization. One of the last topics discussed in Chapter 5 is about self-managing teams, and this deals with how their members basically handle their day-to-day operations by assigning and scheduling work. They make production and service-related decisions amongst themselves, and they take action to remedy problems when they arise. Typically, self-directed teams have higher morale and better results in terms of productivity compared to those who operate with a top-down approach, specifically focusing on this idea that they're able to come together to really fundamentally do a task at hand, but be better able to break down what's expected of them into specific set roles to better aid them in breaking down complicated tasks. There is a lot of factors that go into structural organization, but there is a clear-cut idea of having this clear purpose, measurable goals, and the right mix of experience and commitment to working relationships that give this the groundwork of what needs to be implemented to better aid organizations. And it's up to organizations to really decide on what's most effective for them, depending on whatever process flow that they're expecting to put out, whether it's product output or service output or client experience, in whatever industry that they're working within.